8-story building and you get in the Shabbat elevator and every single floor it stops on all the way up and all the way down. That's all it does all day. So we have to apply what was true in that culture to be true in our culture, but it looks different. And the good news is that's a continued interaction within Scripture, which is great. And then we must make a distinction between what the Bible records and what the Bible approves. Now, there's lots of stories about lots of different things in Scripture, but the Bible, that just because it's in Scripture doesn't mean the Bible approves of it, because some of the things are pretty bad, pretty horrible. Some of the things that people did, some of the things that they said, some of the things they were trying to make happen were pretty bad in life. And so we don't want to just assume that because it's in Scripture, it means it's good. Because it's in Scripture, it may have just been reported or recorded as opposed to being approved. And so we need to take a look at that and use some discernment. Discernment's a big thing when it comes to understanding Scripture, right? What is reasonable? What is real? What makes sense? What doesn't make sense? For instance, in the Protestant tradition, and certainly within the Seventh-day Adventist tradition, we are not kosher. Kosher comes from a health law where it essentially says don't cook a lamb in its mother's milk, right? So the way they've interpreted that and continue to interpret that is that you keep dairy and meat apart from one another on the plate. And when they're cooked, you don't have those things go. That's why certain things will be rabbi approved as kosher. They do that because of that particular health law that comes from, I believe, the book of Leviticus. Now, we don't do that anymore because we don't feel like that cultural distinction makes sense. And we don't believe that it necessarily records that in a way that we have to continue to keep. So you have to use a great deal of discernment in between those things to really understand what we're talking about. 7, we may take a direct application from all of those incidents that the Bible directly censures or approves. There's certain places, 10 Commandments, great example, thou shalt not kill, right? Don't kill. You're a bad neighbor if you kill. And by the way, that was a social contract as much as it was a contract between God and man. The first 5 commandments being between God and man, the second 5 commandments being between human beings and one another. Don't lie, don't kill, don't commit adultery, don't, rape your neighbor's wife. Those are bad things. Don't commit false witness. Those things are for one another. So it was a social contract between us and God, and it was a social contract between human beings, by the way, which was given after they were saved out of Egypt. So they didn't have to keep those things in order to be saved. God had already saved them, and then he gives them this idea of how to live. Well, those things are pretty clear, pretty straightforward, right? If you kill, you're a bad neighbor and you're not a great follower of God. So let's basically try not to kill. So there are some that are absolutely direct applications, but not everything is a direct application. Again, you need to use discernment. You need to know your mind. You need to use your brain to be able to do this. But the more you know about Scripture, the easier those applications become and the more sense that it ultimately makes. Number 8, express commands to individuals are not the will of God for us in some cases. For instance, and this is probably the best example, Abraham was told to offer up his son. If you want to look it up and you don't know it, look up and just Google the sacrifice of Isaac. And if you look at that, you'll see exactly the story that happened. Well, God's not asking you to do that. I'm pretty sure. In fact, I'm 100% sure. A, you may not have a child. B, that's not how God is working anymore. God was working in that particular way for a particular reason, and that story was recorded and written down. But sometimes those express commands don't make sense to us, and so we need to be careful. And by the way, I would say a lot of cults that come from Christianity, it's because someone is interpreting Scripture as if God is speaking directly to them, and there's no idea of anything but a literal application of that. And so we need to be really careful. I think back to many different situations that have ended tragically because people have misinterpreted Scripture as being every direct command being specifically for them, and they see themselves as a biblical character, as an Abraham who was told to offer up his son. Well, God's not saying that to you. But there are some principles in that story of obedience and faithfulness that we can begin to understand. So again, we have to be really discerning in the way that we take a look at this. Number 9, in the lives of men and women in the Bible, determine what the outstanding spiritual truth is. And for example, here we use Hebrews 11, which is this incredible list of biblical heroes, all of which were pretty messed up people, but yet Paul uses them to raise up this idea of faithfulness and of real heroes of the faith. Well, why? Because they made tons of mistakes. The spiritual truth of that is that they remained faithful even when they made mistakes, even when they disappointed God. Obviously, there's a lot more to be said about that, but that's a pretty simple, what is the outstanding spiritual truth that you can then apply to yourself? Remember, a principle is timeless and eternal, so it can apply to everyone. And those are the things that we try and pull out of those particular stories. And whether it's Hebrews 8, whether it's the Old Testament stories, you look for the principle and you look for the outstanding spiritual truth that is a broad understanding. Number 10, in the application of examples to our lives, we do not need a literal reproduction of the biblical situation. In other words, baptism does not need to be done in the River Jordan for it to be a scriptural baptism. We take, again, the principle. And sometimes you have to be careful with literal reproductions or literal interpretations of Scripture. Sometimes people say things like, well, just read the Bible and do what it says. Well, it's not quite that simple. It's also not as hard as some people make it, because, again, God gave you a brain and you should be able to discern and you should be able to process through some of this stuff. And you can do that simply by using these principles of interpretation that we talked about before, and then applying these things to your life. It makes more sense to do it in that regard. And so that's pretty important. Again, some of our online resources, just to let you know, is BibleGateway.com, BlueLetterBible.org. Bible.org has a lot of commentaries, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then net.bible.org, which is probably my favorite when it comes to really interpreting Scripture. I hope this has been helpful, and this kind of concludes 4 pretty significant pieces of lecture, and hopefully you've gained something from it. And when it comes to some of the forum conversations we're going to ask some questions specifically about that. So I guess my question for you on this one would be, how do you read Scripture? How often do you read Scripture? And can you make it a little more part of a consistent practice in your life as you begin to understand it? Do you read it? And then again, I guess we should ask, do you study it and get a little more deep into those understandings? Thank you guys for listening. I always appreciate it. This is Pastor Ian.